If you drive between the Tri-Cities and Walla Walla, you've probably noticed this old schoolhouse in Lowden. Founded in 1983, Lowden No. 41 was the third winery in the Walla Walla Valley. We sat down with the owner and winemaker, Marty Clubb, to talk about this historical site. So Marty, there's a lot of history here at Lowden. I know the schoolhouse here has been, since 1915?
Yes, so actually the history goes back further than that, because this area of the Walla Walla Valley was settled by French Canadians back in the days when they built Fort Walla Walla, and they homesteaded along the river, which is just right outside our front door. And the original old schoolhouse was a log cabin on the river, and then they moved to this site in like the 1890s. And then this school was built in 1915. So we just celebrated the 100th birthday. They actually closed the school in 1974. And my father-in-law, Baker Ferguson, driving down the highway, looked at this and thought, what a great spot to start the winery. Right on the highway, an old schoolhouse with some history behind it, and it would become kind of an iconic image of the winery.
Mm-hmm. What did this schoolhouse, when there were kids here, do you know what this used to look like in here? Like how many kids?
Well, at one point, many years ago, it was kindergarten through 12. But in the later years, it was really an elementary school. It's a 2-room school, so there was the first, second, third grade room, which is now the tasting room, and then now the room we're in was the 4th, 5th, 6th grade room. And they had downstairs there was a stage where they put on plays, and it would be the winter playroom and the lunchroom, and so classic 2-room school.
Mm-hmm. And what have you kept from the original school building?
Well, we've kept really the original layout completely, including the old big windows. The chalkboards are all original to the school. The flooring, this is the original fir flooring. If you go downstairs, there's the children's fountain where they would line up to drink. There's the boys' room on the left, the girls' room on the right. So there's little nuances of things here throughout the building that connect you to the old school.
And the bell that we were ringing outside, explain to me the history and then how you're tying that into the first day of harvest.
The original bell was cast in like 1886. And there is a local art foundry here in Walla Walla, and we took that original cast iron bell and took a mold of it, and then they made a bronze bell. And this happened at a time about 12 years ago when a number of wineries all decided to create their own harvest bell. And so our harvest bell now is out front, and people ring the bell, to announce, hey, I'm here at the old schoolhouse. But the connection with the wine industry was in the old world in France. There was this tolling of the bells to ring in harvest, that it's time to pick the grapes, and they would ring in the bells. So there are now a dozen wineries in Walla Walla that have a unique harvest bell, and every time we bring in our first fruit, we ring the bell to alert everybody that harvest has begun. Everybody goes to school, and everybody has a connection with the school. We have photography of classroom pictures of many of the locals who went to school here, and we have people who come to the front door and knock on the door, and they say, do you mind if I come in and tour? Because I went to school here 50 years ago. And
wow.
So that's really fun, because they'll go, I remember, when we did this play in the basement. It's still very much alive in terms of people's memory. The school was active until 1974. So of course not your generation.
I was born in '83.
So this is a pretty cool spot, because this is where the winery actually was in 1983 when they first started harvest. So to remember that, we have some photographs over here of Gene and Baker making wine their first year, the early barrels in the room. And then this wall, this is where there was a stage, and every year the kids did some kind of play. And the last play they did was a Christmas pageant. So you can see the camels on the wall and the palm trees, and there was a building, you know, with the birth of Jesus, and we used this room really to host tastings and dinners and kind of do the memory of the early days of the winery.
Okay, Marty, you guys won the Decanter World Wine Award. Tell me what that means to you guys.
Well, first off, this was huge. We basically won the best Bordeaux blend in the world for our Ferguson wine from our new estate, Ferguson Vineyard, 2 summers ago in 2014 in London at the Decanter World Wine Awards. And the whole idea of just beating Napa, you know, to us is a big deal.
Oh, yeah.
But we not only beat Napa, we beat Bordeaux itself to win the best Bordeaux blend in the world.
That's definitely, yes.
So this was big for us. It was big for Washington State, because to say that we have the growing climate to make wines that can win the international trophy means we are a special growing site for wine. So many people, in talking about the Ferguson Award, said this is another Judgment of Paris tasting. And what they meant by that was in the 1970s, there was a tasting put on in Paris with French wine critics where they blind tasted some of the best wines from California with some of the best wines from France. And California won. And California won in a big way. And that became known as the Judgment of Paris, and they made a movie out of it. Bottle Shock was the movie made out of this tasting that literally put Napa Valley on the map. So the analogy is, since we have a wine from Washington State that took the trophy for best Bordeaux blend in the world, was another little mini
that you can kind of compare
second
it to
Judgment
the
of Paris.
Thing.
Yeah,
that's awesome. And you've won multiple other awards too. What are some of those
Yeah,
awards?
we have. So the one that one of the awards we're most proud of is Wine and Spirits Magazine picks a Winery of the Year award. Well, we won that award in 2001 and then consecutively won that award 14 years in a row, which there are only 4 wineries in the world that have that many consecutive awards.
Today we're up in the award-winning Ferguson Vineyard, and we're going to get a little bit of a geology lesson, joined of course by Marty, the owner, and the winemaker as well. What makes this vineyard so unique?
Well, we're at a fairly high elevation here, almost 1,500 feet, and you can see this is part of a quarry that's on the edge of the vineyard. And what we have here is a wall of fractured basalt. And so this basalt was from lava flows that happened 15 million years ago.
Wow, okay.
And it's hard, it looks like it's solid, but I'm gonna reach in and see how it comes apart in your fingers?
Oh, wow, yeah.
So it's very fragile. And that means the vines actually can grow down through the very thin topsoil and grow into the basalt itself.
And now, is there a lot of nutrients? How did you know that this would be perfect for a vineyard?
Well, we actually didn't know. We did know from people that grow grapes in France that basalt was very coveted. It's hard to see dirt here, but there's actually right here, if you look closely, the dirt kind of has a red substance to it, and that's basically, it's kind of an iron-rich red clay. And so the vines are actually accessing that rich iron magnesium minerality from the basalt, and then has access to that clay component. So it's a very, very unique soil that provides a unique flavor profile to the vineyard.
And when I say award-winning, this vineyard is truly unique.
Yes. We, as you know, we won the international trophy from Decanter. As it turns out, we've won a second international trophy for Ferguson. There is a competition put on by New World wine countries called the Six Nations Wine Challenge. So that includes Canada, the United States, South Africa, Chile, New Zealand, and Australia. And there are 6 judges. Each of these judges recommends 100 wines to this competition. In our case, we were entered in the Bordeaux Blend category, and we went on to win that international trophy for Best New World Bordeaux Blend.
Wow. So that's 2 international awards that you've gotten so
Yeah,
far.
very exciting for us. We couldn't be more pleased. And what's really, really exciting about that really makes a statement about not only this unique vineyard site, but really makes a statement about the quality of wines from the Walla Walla Valley, the quality of wines from Washington State, and of course from Lowden number 41.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Here we are on the edge of the vineyard, kind of right at the top, and you can see there's a couple of feet of soil on top. This is a wind deposited ground soil that came from the glacial flood silts, and it's sitting here right on the interface with the basalt. So right here is the hard rock, the fractured basalt, and so you have the vine roots growing down and then trying to penetrate down into the basalt.
Okay, so we are now up on the highest elevation here in the Ferguson Vineyard.
Right, so the very top of the property is about 1,500 feet, and we're probably about 1,450 right here where we're standing.
Okay, so we have the old vines that have been planted for quite some time, and then you're also looking at
New vines.
The new vines that you just planted here recently.
Right, so this is a Cabernet block, Cabernet Sauvignon, and this was planted in 2009.
Okay.
And this was just planted this year. You can see the vines are in what's called grow tubes. And those grow tubes, act to, one, protect the vine as it's growing, but they also increase the heat so that they grow faster. And so we keep them in growth tubes up through the next year. But next year we'll start training those vines on the wire.
How long does it take for a new vine to produce grapes?
Usually we think of vines from the day they first leafed out. So when the vine is planted, a few weeks later it leaves out, that's year 1. And then typically you have fruit in year 3.
Year 3.
So the 3rd year that the vine's planted.
So being up at a higher elevation, wind is a really big problem up here.
Yes, well, it becomes something that's harder to manage because it's constantly blowing. And so if we left the canopy to flop open a little more, it would kind of beat itself against the wire. So we keep it in a fairly tight, vertically trained position. We use drip irrigation to augment what little rainfall we have. We may add 7 or 8 inches of additional water during the course of the year. But we pretty much, it's a very dry. We want the canopy to be a little stressed in terms of water, and that tends to produce smaller berries, smaller clusters, which makes for more intense flavor in the wine. I like to say we play a game of Chinese water torture on our vines.
What's the order? And we talked about this already, but what are some of the first grapes that you tend to pick and then versus the last?
Well, different varieties mature at different times, thank goodness, because otherwise we'd be picking everything all at once and it'd be totally unmanageable. We tend to pick the Semillon and Sauvignon Blanc grapes as far as white wines relatively early. Merlot also tends to be on the early part of the curve. And then we typically, as we get a little bit further into the season, we start picking Syrah. And Cabernet Sauvignon tends to be the variety that tends to be toward the latter part. So we're usually Cabernet Sauvignon is going to be the end of September, well into October, as well as the other Bordeaux varieties like Cabernet Franc or Petit Verdot. They're always on the cooler late side.
So Marty, you're more old school as far as picking the grapes and harvesting goes.
Well, we like to think of that way. We're, a relatively small winery, and we tend to make wine and process wine in an old school sort of way, meaning we handpick all of our fruit. Our red wines are destemmed and only lightly crushed. Looks like whole berries coming out of the fermenter. And we crush that into small open top fermenters that we punch down by hand. And then we do a very soft pressing once the fermentation's done. So the whole process is really designed to be very little manipulation of fruit, very little anything added. We don't like to add anything. We like the wines to be as natural as possible.
Mm-hmm. You're the winemaker, and this is your lab and where you come to make sure the fruit is ready to be harvested. What do you have in front of me? I know you have 3 different devices, sugar, acid. Explain to me.
At least in terms of sampling fruit, we do a few basic things. So those things are, we will run a sugar test, or the Brix, which is a measure of essentially how much sugar by weight is accumulated in the fruit. We will use a pH meter to look at the pH level of the fruit, and basically as the fruit matures, the pH is climbing, but pH has a lot to do with stability of how the wine will ultimately age, and so you're trying to pick before the pH gets too high. Mm-hmm. So you're monitoring this pH. And then just also we titrate the wine sample with sodium hydroxide to measure how much total acid is in the wine. So these are just the 3 basic lab tests we do on samples, mm-hmm. just to help give us additional data on how, where's the fruit in terms of its readiness to harvest. This is Merlot from Pepperbridge Vineyard that is not ready to pick, yet there's nice bright coloration of the fruit. So that's right off the bat, there's something really positive here, that I would look at this as showing early color development in the fruit, which is a very positive indicator of good quality. And just to give you a quick little sample, we have a refractometer and then a little handheld unit that measures the sugar. So this particular sample says 21.5. So we know just looking at this sample that it probably has another maybe as much as 2 weeks.
Okay.
It depends on the weather. If it stays cool, it could be longer. If it warms up, it could accelerate the maturation of the fruit, and we might be picking sooner than we thought.
So what do you guys have in these bins over here?
Well, these are different lots of wines that we recently brought in the last few days. This is actually some Merlot from Dionysus Vineyard that came in yesterday. And so it's, you can see on one side of the bin there's just some juice, but over here all of a sudden you see a little fermentation activity going on. So mm-hmm. These bins are just beginning to ferment. And we have some fruit, say over here, that we picked on the weekend, and this is actually Syrah, and it's a much more active fermentation. You don't really see it on the surface because all the activity is happening right below all these skins. Be careful, because when you get lower here, you're going to get CO2, but if you put your ear down here, you can hear it go. It's snap, crackle, pop. It's like Rice Krispies down here.
Oh, yeah.
The reason these skins are on the surface is that CO2 from the fermentation is pushing the skins to the surface. So twice a day we come in here and mix these bins up, in part to keep the skins wet, to keep everything clean and fermenting well, and in part to get a little bit better color extraction on the red wines.
Okay. So how long do you leave them here in the bins?
Okay, so the fermentation will last anywhere from 7 to 12 days, but once the fermentation slows down, there's less CO2 coming, and so the cap gets really soft. And after we do the punch down, you'll begin to see puddling of juice. And at that point, we have to press. And what we do is we'll take this bin and literally pour it into the press out on the crush pad and squeeze all the juice out of the berries, and it'll just be red wine at that point. So technically at that point, it's officially red wine.
So we'll move on to the white wine.
These are white, we're fermenting in barrel, Semillon and Sauvignon Blanc. So when we pick the grapes, it goes immediately in the press. We press off the skins. The juice is racked to tank. We settle it to allow the solids to settle out. And then the clean juice is pumped into these barrels to actually barrel ferment. So this juice, is because it's not wine yet, still grape juice, was put in these barrels this morning. And so it'll begin this process of fermentation. It'll also take 7 to 10 days. And we have these bungs that allow that CO2 to come out of the juice. You can see the holes. So these barrels will be spewing carbon dioxide during the process of fermentation.
Now in this room, this is where you're gonna eventually put the wine into the barrel.
Yeah, so this is our red wine production room. We have these 5-ton fermenters that will mostly be used for Cabernet Sauvignon. They're also punched down, but done hydraulically with a big punch. And then all the barrels in this room will be part of our 2016 red wine barrel program. And we have, for this vintage alone, about 1,500 barrels. So that kind of adds up.
Yeah. So you were one of the first wineries here in Walla Walla. How have you just seen the wine industry expand and blossom here?
Well, it's been a very interesting journey because, as you know, when we started, which was 1983, L'Ecole was the 3rd winery in Walla Walla. Leonetti was #1, Woodward Canyon was #2. Maybe the 3 of us are kind of thought of as the early pioneer wineries. We saw kind of an explosive growth in the 90s, and that only even accelerated more once we got into the 2000s. So today, Walla Walla has about 140, 150 wineries. We were the 20th winery in Washington State, and now there's 900 wineries in the state. In the early days, I think some of the early viticultural pioneers like Walter Clore, they looked at our history of climate and temperatures, and so the thinking was we would be more of a cool climate, more white wine focused, like Riesling and Chenin Blanc. And it's turned out that it's been warmer in the last 30 years, and so you've seen a transition to warmer climate red varieties like Cabernet Sauvignon, like Merlot, and like Syrah from the Rhone Valley. And of course, many of those wines now are really putting Washington on the map.
Thank you for joining us on our visit to L'Ecole number 41. Please tune in next time as we visit another local Washington winery.
This wood breathes. So the advantage of a barrel aging is that there's this very slow micro-oxygenation that's going on that helps settle the reds and that little bit of oxygen pickup, and you get some evaporative loss. So you lose, through evaporation, 1 bottle of wine per barrel per month. Do you know what they call that? The old Christian monks, when they were like, where's this wine going? They called that the angel share. Because who else would be taking the wine away from them? The monks.